Everybody, I wanted to talk somewhat trepidatiously about Neil Young versus Joe Rogan, also Spotify. I guess Spotify would be the referee in all this, right? So I kind of wanted to give my thoughts somewhat cautiously on this important subject. I hope you'll consider watching. Well, like I said, I give a little. I'll give a little disclaimer. I'm really not trying to get into the weeds of what they were arguing about or anything like that in the particulars. And I also don't consider myself a Joe Rogan fan. I think I've maybe watched a half hour to 45 minutes of his show total. But I am a Neil Young fan. I've been listening to Neil Young since like the seventh or eighth grade. I think I bought Harvest some early in high school, and it's always been one of my favorite albums. And I've had several of others of his records over the years. After the Gold Rush, and so I do consider myself pretty knowledgeable, if I do say so myself, on Neil Young. I might even do a little Neil Young acoustic thing in the middle of the night and stick it up there if anybody wants to watch it, because I play a bunch of Neil Young songs on the acoustic guitar. But, you might know that Joe Rogan, I guess, has a podcast. I don't know that much about it. Apparently it has 11 million viewers, listeners, whatever you do with the podcast, on Spotify. And I don't understand Spotify that well. I actually have some music on Spotify, but I don't pay much attention to it. But and he's had some guests on his show that Neil Young didn't agree with. He felt like they were giving false facts and things like that. So Neil Young gave an ultimatum to Spotify: either pull Joe Rogan off Spotify or you can't use my music on Spotify. And late this week, Spotify pulled Neil Young's music. I thought it was really sad, and I was trying to think what I actually think of all this because I'm such a big Neil Young fan. I guess one takeaway I have is it does seem to me that our culture is pretty different in 2022 than it was in, say, 1972, when Neil Young was just entering into the greatness of his artistry, coming out of Buffalo Springfield. He'd actually, by 72, been around for a while, but he was already out of Buffalo Springfield, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. What year did Harvest come out? But anyway, let's compare. Now, today we have contentious issues, and Neil Young wanted to pull Joe Rogan off Spotify. So I'm thinking about that in comparison to, say, 1972. In 1972, George Wallace was a Democratic presidential candidate. George Wallace was supported by numerous country artists, including Tammy Wynette, Hank Snow, among many others. And, of course, a lot of those country artists, kind of the Grand Ole Opry crowd, actually supported states' rights, segregation, whatever you want to call it, all through the 50s and 60s, often fairly unashamedly. But one thing I don't remember Neil Young doing is saying, gee, if you play Hank Snow on this radio station, even if it's on the other end of the dial or something, you can't play Heart of Gold. I'm not going to let you play my music. If this, if Tammy Wynette, has anything to do with this record label, then, you can't have my music for this record label. And I was just thinking that our culture is so different now. But you know what Neil Young did do is he wrote some damn good songs. He wrote Alabama, Southern Man, among other songs, which commented on racism in the South. And, of course, I think we all know racism is one of the main issues, probably the most important and horrible part of American history. But Neil Young wrote music about it. And those are classic songs, Alabama, Southern Man. And of course, in response to that, Leonard Skinner wrote Sweet Home Alabama. And I guess we got at least three good songs out of that exchange. But gosh, Neil Young's written a lot of great songs that had a social conscience, not only Southern Man in Alabama, but also Ohio, Four Dead in Ohio, which is about the Kent State killings. And that's an example of how important musical expression is. That song has made the Kent State killings really part of American history and culture in a way it would have never been if it was all just a bunch of policy analysts and student term papers. That song made it live in a very living, vital way, and that's the importance of music. And I guess I feel bad. I feel like that impulse in him must be diminished with age, or maybe our world's so different that none of us feel it the same way anymore. But Ohio's a great example of a response to what you perceive to be wrong, and responding through music, not just trying to deplatform the National Guard or something like that. But what I don't remember anyone doing in that period, unless my memory is fuzzy, I was just a kid, but I don't remember anyone saying, you have to pull Tammy Wynette off record labels or anything like that. But I do remember lots of artists that didn't agree with that perspective writing great songs about it. Dylan wrote Oxford Town, and so many others. I think Pete Seeger. I mean, look at Joan Baez. A lot of those artists, they wrote and sang about problems and racism. And I do think our muscle memory for creativity and the arts is so muted. I think we've become kind of a hall monitor culture, like a sort of institutional. I always thought that when music becomes really invested in politics, it is diminished. I got to be careful saying that, because certainly there were a lot of great political songs. Pete Seeger did a lot of great political songs, and Dylan wrote Oxford Town, and there was a lot of protest music in the '60s about the Vietnam War, and there was also a lot of kind of pro. Conservative music too, if you want to call it that. Some would call it reactionary, but certainly a lot of good music that comes out of that impulse too. But I think if it gets too extreme, the music is diminished. And I've always thought that. I think that's sort of true about Ted Nugent. I think it's true about David Crosby, and a little bit about Neil Young. I think when they get up there and scream about impeaching the president, it just seems less. It connects less at a human level. And I'm not even saying, it's not whether you agree or disagree with it, or it's just, and we all have that impulse, in when we express ourselves. But I've always thought that kind of extreme politics, and maybe ideology is a better word, diminishes the arts. Not that art can't be a vehicle for expressing ideas that are political or social in nature, but I think when it becomes extreme, it sort of forces out the human part of us that create. One thing I will say is I watched some of that Joe Rogan, and it sounded like a conversation. I don't think it was an academic presentation or an official presentation. It was a conversation. Most of those shows seem like conversations. And there is such a thing as the art of conversation, and conversation is good. And I think it's kind of a funny impulse where we monitor conversations. That was a conversation, and there's nothing wrong with having a conversation. Goodness gracious. Joe Rogan kind of reminds me of people like Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Ted Nugent, in that he really doesn't have a boss. Eric Clapton, Ted Nugent, Keith Richards, these guys haven't ever had a boss. Paul McCartney, they've been really doing whatever they wanted since they were 18 or 19. And the only people they really answer to are the millions of people who love their music and buy their music. And that's kind of like Joe Rogan. And something tells me that we're that model of just sort of independent operator that's so successful and popular is going to be more and more problematic going forward. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong, because it's actually very liberating. These people, they might piss you off sometimes, or me, but they say whatever the hell they want. So I do think it's kind of interesting that in 1972, the idea was to sort of create a response artistically, humanistically, and in 2022, we appeal to institutional authority like Spotify or a court or, or something that's more institutional. And I do think it's partially because our creative muscles are so atrophied compared to in 1972. And, in 1,000 years, no one's going to remember who the Surgeon General was or the Attorney General. Probably most people won't remember who the president was. They won't remember who George Wallace was in 1972 either, probably most people, or Richard Nixon or George McGovern, or who else was there? Ed Muskie, I don't remember. Shirley Chisholm, I remember some of those people, yeah. But you know what they will remember? Sweet Home Alabama by Leonard Skinner, Alabama by Neil Young, Southern Man by Neil Young. Those will be around for 1,000 years because that's what's going to last. The expressions of the human spirit. So I guess my conclusion is that I was a little sad to see Neil Young come out with this ultimatum. And it didn't make me not like Neil Young so much as it made me sad for 2022, where our society's changed so much that you have this great artist named Neil Young whose impulse is to go to, I guess Spotify would be kind of like a record company and try to get someone kicked off the platform instead of, I think, what he would have done 50 years ago, which is write a song or respond in some creative way, which would have had a more lasting significance. I know a lot of politics is short term, if you think about it, and very materialistic. But Neil Young's music is not short term and it's not materialistic. It's humanistic, and it's some of those songs will be around for centuries. And I wish he had that impulse instead of just appealing to authority, because I think that says something very bad about 2022. I imagine other people would disagree with me, and well, it's easy for you to say, or the issues are so important that we. But I guess you could say that about everything, and pretty soon you're living in North Korea, But be creative, people. Write essays, write, draw, create, philosophize, dream, beats complaining and snitching. But I remain a big Neil Young fan to the end. I mean, how could you not be? Such great, some of those great songs he did. Like Hurricanes, I've always thought was one of his very best songs. And some of those one-note guitar solos he did. But anyway, I'm a bigger Neil Young fan than I am a Joe Rogan fan, but I think I'm taking Joe Rogan's side in this. Thanks. God bless.